Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom with Bob Olson, who will now introduce today's show and speaker.
WCAT Radio presents The Messenger, with messages of things happening, amazing things happening within the Catholic Church. And now here's our host, Tony Szalkiewicz, The Messenger.
Good evening. Tonight we have a very special guest, Father John Gallagher from St. Pius X Parish in Middletown, Connecticut. And we're going to be interviewing him a little bit, and he's going to share. We gave him a lot of latitude to speak about everything he wanted to speak about tonight. But to give you a little bit of what St. Pius X Parish is, I believe there's if this is correct, Father John, the last count I had was like 1,600 parishioners, families?
Yeah, it's just around 1,400.
1,400 families. Wow, that's a lot of families. And they also have a lot of ministry, groups and ministries within the church. And I'll mention a couple. The liturgical ministries, of course. They have the choir members. They have the folk group, funeral ministers, Eucharistic ministers. They have instrumentalists, lectors, ushers and greeters, youth ensemble, outreach ministries. They also have the faith formation ministries, the peer ministries, justice and human dignity ministries, sanctity of life, and rolling deck ministry. What is rolling deck, Father?
Rolling Deck is a group of people who meet basically to advocate for the needs of, first to affirm the dignity of every person, and to sort of advocate for the needs of individuals and families who are affected by disabilities.
Oh.
The goal of it is sort of full inclusion of people with any type of disability in the St. Pius Church community. So, for example, they, a few years back, came up with having once a month the Mass, 10:30 Mass on Sunday, done in sign language for the who are hearing impaired. They did a simple thing like create cushions for people to make available to people who come to church if they want, who maybe have difficult sitting in the hard pews. They helped us with improving the sound system, for creating a space for persons with disabilities, for finding a way to bring communion to people who may not want to necessarily sit in a special section, but are scattered throughout the church. So there's been many sort of things like that they advocate for and work with us, including at times the preparation of persons with disabilities, the special preparation to receive sacraments when they're a certain. Wow. So it's a pretty wide-ranging group that they're always sort of out there, kind of seeing what we can do to help better include people.
That's beautiful. Okay, I remember the sign language that, but I didn't realize it had a title of a group, the ministry, a rolling deck.
Right.
That's beautiful. They also have at your parish the Sanctity of Life ministry, and then there's a couple other ministries and groups, the Arts and Crafts. Then they have the Auctions, a men's club. And then they have the Secular Franciscans, and then they have the Share. So that's a pretty active parish, isn't it?
Right.
I'm wondering, is that very active as compared to other churches?
I don't know. I can't compare. It's certainly active in a sense compared to other parishes I've been in. there's a lot of things going on here. And there's actually, in the past couple of years, there are some new ones, some new ministries that have kind of grown that I think are really very helpful. For example, over the past maybe 3 years, we developed a ministry called Friendly Visitors. So we had, of course, like almost every parish, Eucharistic ministers bringing communion to the homebound, or, for some reason, maybe temporarily in a rehab or something. But, we did it as the need arose. But we expanded it with several training sessions for people who simply go to visit. They may or may not bring communion, but they go and they visit people who are homebound on some sort of a regular basis. Sometimes it's weekly, sometimes it's monthly. And as I said, they may or may not be Eucharistic ministers, but they sort of become, friends. And in some cases, it offers respite for people who are taking care of someone who is homebound. And we had, the last time I looked, we were up to 37 people of being visited on at least on a monthly basis. So it really expanded, and then sort of providentially from that, it sort of morphed into the prayer shawl ministry. So because of visiting people who were homebound and in some cases, pretty sick, they started from that the prayer shawl ministry, which, people, again, they knit the prayer shawls. Sometimes they come together and do it as a group. Sometimes they do part of it at home. They share materials. We had a lot of material donated, and then they do it, and they pray as they do it. They pray for that person, and then we bless the prayer shawl when it's completed, and then the friendly visitors or Eucharistic ministers will take them and give them to people in their homes with a special card, letting them know that this was done by loving prayers of people for them. So it's kind of spread out, from bringing communion simply to the homebound to now a much larger thing.
That's beautiful. You reminded me when I had hurt my back a couple years ago. I did receive one of those prayer shawls from one of my Carmelite sisters. It's very special. It is special to receive something like that.
Yeah, people, they appreciate it. So another thing that we, just in terms of the past few years, these are kind of newer things that have developed. One was we put in the past several years. Every parish that I've ever been in tries in some way, struggles with trying to provide ministry for the youth, to young people, teenagers, and especially the focus seems to go always first on high school, on teenagers. And St. Pius has a long tradition of having a pretty strong program of youth ministry for teenagers. We call it peer ministry. But we felt that there was kind of a gap in the junior high level where those kids, as they change, especially in the school system we have in town, where they go to a different school and they're not high school kids yet, but they're not elementary school kids either. So our faith formation directors went on to create what we called youth ministry, which was specifically first geared for junior high, for 6th, 7th, and 8th grade, to bring them together once a month. It's not an overtly religious gathering. So, for instance, we tell the kids, you can bring your friends. They don't have to be Catholic. We're not doing any kind of, direct evangelization. We're not trying to turn who comes into being Catholic, just to bringing them together. And then they do, when they come together, they do many good works. So, for example, usually every year, one of the first things they do is create no-sew blankets for for children at the psychiatric hospital here in Middletown. So they create these no-sew blankets, and it's a whole night-long project that they do for that. They do like at Thanksgiving and Christmas. They'll do, and I guess Easter. They'll do create like a decoration for the homebound, and then they create a card. They create a basket of goodies, a little bag of goodies to give to the homebound. So it kind of gets them occupied. And then what's happened with that group is, as kids got to be past 8th grade, some continued to come anyway. So they didn't age out of the thing because they're no longer, allowed. So it's grown in the sense of the kids come, even though the original intent was to try to really focus on the junior high age youth. On the other end of the spectrum, though, is another perennial challenge for parishes and the Catholic Church in general is young adults. So, kids graduate from high school. Many times they go off to college somewhere, and frequently, or at least occasionally, they'll come back to visit, but they don't necessarily return. And in many cases, as we know in the church in general, they become distanced from the church. They just kind of get involved in things, and their life goes in different directions, and they're not involved. So we've purposely tried to focus in the past 5 years on young adult activities, and it is a challenge because this isn't a thing where young people they may be single. We have people who are married or people who are engaged to be married. So, but it's a group that is moving on in life. They're at the time when they may be, just settling in. They may have just gotten married, or they're getting married, and then they get a job someplace else and they move on. But they have different interests. These are the millennials, and an area that certainly we try to reach out to, as Pope Francis has said, and things that interest them. The good part about it is because of their age, the people who are involved are very self-directed. This is something that you just need to help to give them support in organizing, and they run with it themselves.
That's good.
So it's and again filling in that gap, and then after a number of years you see. I've been here now at St. Pius 6 years, so you see people who might have been in this age group 6 years ago who since then have gotten married. Now they have a child, and their life has started to settle into that part where they have a family, and then they kind of blend in to the community. So we try to make that transition from simply faith formation, what we used to call CCD, through junior high into high school and peer ministry, and then into young adult ministry, so that it's somewhat seamless.
Yeah, I did my wife and I got involved with that with a bunch of adults a few years back, for about 6.5 years, with basically a high school crowd. My daughters were involved. And the story went... I was part of the adults council for St. Pius, and being the youngest one, they kept saying to me, we need you to start a youth group. And I said, no, I'm not doing a youth group. I came and handle my own kids. And it went on that for about 6 months. We want you to do a youth group, and I kept denying it. So I always say the golden hour, 3 a.m. in the morning, I hear this one word, now. And I've recognized the word, the voice. And I said, "What now, Lord?" And I heard, "Now youth group." And I said, "No, I'm not doing youth group." And he kept saying, "Now youth group, now youth group." And he wouldn't let me go to sleep. It just kept repeating constantly in my head, "Now youth group." So at the time, it was Father Karen. I shared with him the next day. I said, "This is what happened." He burst into laughter. He thought that was the funniest thing. He put me with Father Don Lininger. So I met with Father Don, and Father Don says, "I don't want to do a youth group." I said, "Neither do I." And I told him the story, which he got a laugh out of it. So he says, Father John goes, well, we'll throw a fleece out there. And I said, what do you mean a fleece? He says, we'll call for a meeting. If there's 5 or more kids, we'll do it. But if it's less than 5, we're not doing it. I said, you're on. So we had the first meeting, and 6 kids showed up, and we did it for 6.5 years. It was a blast. There's funny stories all associated with that, which I've shared on the air. It's a beautiful ministry. So you get called into it, and then you move on to do something else.
Right.
But it was great. We did like 13 retreats, and what we did was in the fall we went up to Trinita, New Hartford, Connecticut, where there's a 200-year-old farmland up there. Some nuns were taking care of it, and then some lay people took it over. I understand some nuns are back there, but Trinita in New Hartford. So that was basically Christian action, finding Christ through Christian action, interplaying, and not so much biblical teaching, that sort of thing.
Right.
And then in the spring, what we did, we went down to my father's house in Mooders, Connecticut, with Father Bill McCarthy, and we did a work retreat in Thanksgiving for the whole year that we've had all the graces. So it kind of worked out pretty good. But it was a good time.
Yeah.
So you have, so tell me, it's interesting to me how you came to become a priest.
Well, it's interesting to me too. I think in some ways growing up, because I lived in a pretty Catholic area in the Bronx, New York, and I went to Catholic school. It was really just across the street from where we lived, so we were certainly cultural Catholics all the way. And so you had kind of weekly, at least, or even more because of going to the Catholic school, contact with the clergy, with the priests. And so I had, I think, like many other people of my era, that kind of contact. I went to Catholic education all the way through. So when I went to high school, I went to Cardinal Hayes High School in the Bronx, which was a large school. It had 2,800 boys in the school, and a large amount of clergy and religious brothers in the school. We had 26 diocesan priests who taught it.
Wow. Wow.
And we had 19 Zavarian brothers, one of whom was here in Middletown until recently, Brother Hooley. He was taught in
yes.
school. We had
wow.
We had 21 Marist brothers, and I think 6 Irish Christian brothers. So we were pretty much, around clergy. And so I think it was during those years that just kind of mixing in with them that, the idea goes in and out of your mind on occasion. Wow, what do these people do? Would I like to be like them? And so on. The only thing I did know is I wasn't attracted to being a teacher. I just never really had. I never felt I had that thing. It's obviously a whole lifestyle of being a teacher, and it wasn't part of the appeal. So, like a lot of other people, I put it off. I graduated, I moved on, and when I left high school, I had really no interest in going to college. I was living at home with my mother. My father had just died. I was the last person at home with her, and I wanted to go to work and sort of help support the family, which I did. And the job I took from high school was on Wall Street, and I worked for a week, and then the first day of the next week I quit. I said, this is not for me.
Why did you quit?
Pushing papers all day, was just not my thing. So I couldn't stand it, so I quit. And I went back to a job that I had had all through high school, which was being a bus mechanic. And, that's what I went back to do. Not that I intended to have it be my lifelong career, but I needed a job, and I couldn't stand on Wall Street. So I did that for another full year. I was a bus mechanic. I had been that, plus, bus driver for the company. But then I also realized, I need to get more education. So I began to go to night school, night college, after working at the bus company all day. And I went first to Manhattan College in the Bronx. Then I changed over to Iona College in New Rochelle. And it's in this time that I met the Capuchins, because in my town, in Yonkers, New York, where I was living at the time, my friends, classmates from grammar school, some of whom had gone to the Capuchin High School in Yonkers. I didn't. I had actually never been there. I didn't even know where it was from the other side of town. And so they said, at one point, we were out of high school now, and they said, oh, why don't you come with us, because we play in the bagpipe band. And why don't you just, come to practice, because we go out for pizza afterwards. So I went, and
you went for the pizza.
Ironically, I was the only Scotsman in the group. All of my friends were Italian.
That's funny.
So the next thing you know, I just went to be with them for the pizza, and the next thing you know, they were teaching me how to play the bagpipes.
Are you serious?
Yeah.
That's funny. You did learn them?
I ended up, becoming part of the band, and at the same time, the same group of my friends from our home parish, they also were playing in the folk group at the Capuchin Parish in Yonkers. So they asked me, they said, oh, we need a bass player, so why don't you come? So I said, I don't play bass. So, well, we'll teach you. So I went, and I ended up getting involved also in the parish there. And that was the first time I met a Capuchin. I was already 18 years old, and I had lived in Yonkers for 8 years at that point, but I had never even heard of them. I heard of the school, but I didn't know what a Capuchin was. So that now it percolated within me these, this idea of maybe I want to be like them, and they were different kind of priests to me. Not like the basics they had in high school or the people I knew at home, but they were so different that I was sort of a little afraid to, just go up and say, gee, I think I might want to be a priest, because I figured I'd be on the first bus out in the morning out to Wisconsin, and I wasn't ready for it. So I went to the diocesan seminary, which was also there in Yonkers, and I met with the vocation director, and and he explained you have to do this and that, and it didn't appeal to me. That life somehow didn't appeal to me. So I said, I knew this was a bad idea. Forget about it. But I couldn't forget about it. It kept coming back. So finally, I went to, now I had come to know several of the friars because of the folk group, because of the bagpipe band, and like St. Pius, there was a big community of friars. As a matter of fact, in that parish, in that friary in Yonkers, they had 20 friars living in the house. So you got to meet a lot of different, and they were different people. And so I became more and more interested in their life. And I didn't really even understand the difference between being a friar and being a priest. My interest initially was I wanted to be a priest. I knew I didn't want to be a teacher.
So what is the difference before you go on? What is that difference?
Well, friars are brothers to one another. And and I have to admit to you that even when I first entered the community, I didn't really fully understand that. I went with the intention of I want to be a Capuchin priest. So you learn, all of our early formation is about being formed for religious life. And doesn't focus on being a priest. We're young, we needed to go to college, but it's really about kind of religious conversion. Much like St. Francis, when he gathered the first friars, he wasn't looking to establish a group of priests and brothers.
Right.
Some of the people that wanted to follow him, wanted to live as part of his community, were already already priests. And so they joined, and they were priests already. And, of course, then others, began to come. And because they were preaching, that was their ministry, was itinerant preaching, just going around. In those days particularly, that they didn't just let anybody preach. You had to have sort of a shingle, authorization by the bishop or by the pope to preach. So priesthood, the ordination became one of those things, although, by the way, St. Francis himself was not a priest, he was a deacon, and it seems that he was a deacon so that he could preach had his shingle, with no questions asked. So that was my interest, and then, I gradually, of course, as you're kind of learning to be a friar in the early years of our formation in temporary vows, you're also we were going to college, and now, of course, I had been to 2 different schools for night school, but now once I knew I wanted to be a friar, then I shifted my studies away from business, which is what they had started with, to philosophy and theology courses, so that I could get as much background as I could possibly get. And that's how I finished my degree up in full-time college for 2 years in St. Anselm in Manchester, New Hampshire, with a bachelor in philosophy degree. And then finally, our theology in my time was done at Mary Knowles School of Theology in Ottawa. And that itself was a wonderful experience, because it was a very different kind of seminary, because you were rubbing shoulders with people from all over the world, China, South America, India, just all kinds of places. And these are the people you were studying with, and it had a very mission-oriented sort of approach to theology and even pastoral ministry. So I'm always very grateful for that experience, and it helped, because once I was ordained a priest, my assignments have been in varied ways, but very much and very Capuchin kinds of things. So for example, right after ordination, I was assigned to our parish in Brooklyn, New York, which was originally a German parish, but over the years had gone from German to Italian, and then more recently to Spanish-speaking. And so I never in my life ever thought I didn't want to say I want to work with Spanish-speaking people. I never even dreamt of it, and yet here I was right after ordination, and the only Spanish I had was from high school. So I had to start catch up to go to take classes to try to begin to learn Spanish, to work with people. And then, I moved on, and of course I was only there 1 year, and I was assigned to New Hampshire to work in vocation ministry. So, that's a completely opposite kind of job or ministry, because here you're first of all, you spend all your time in the car, you're driving all over the place, meeting with people. My area was central New England. So I had Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and the diocese of Rhode Island, and then Norwich diocese. And so I spent 1 year in that place, and then I was same ministry, but I was moved down to New York to do it, and then my area changed to be Long Island, and the state of New York, and the diocese of Bridgeport. So, I spent about 4 years doing that, but I was still living at the parish that I had been assigned at, and so I was getting more and more involved with the Spanish ministry there. I was getting a little bit proficient, and when I was home, because I got to know the people, and you get involved in the parish activities and things they're doing. So I became more proficient and more interested, and then finally they made me pastor of the place. So I I was 35 years old at the time, and I really still was not, at all perfectly bilingual. I was still needed to study in Spanish, so I went away for 6 weeks to Dominican Republic and Puerto Rico, and I studied in this program of basically a mentor kind of arrangement. It was a few of us to one teacher, and then, sometimes one-to-one, and that was it. And then you say, okay, now you've got it. So I worked in that parish as pastor for 6 years, and it was a very challenging area because it was a very part of
multicultural.
Well, it was Spanish, more and more becoming more and more, Spanish, and very poor, and a lot of violence, a lot of crime at that time in that part of the city. So it was a wonderful experience of priestly ministry, but it almost psychologically, I always think of it as that the great challenge there was psychological, because there was so much crime and violence that the people experienced, and that you were in the middle of too, that just to keep your sanity was a great challenge. So when and it was a big complex. It was a huge parish in its day. It had a high school. It had 2 high schools. It had a boys' and a girls' high school, and a
really.
So administratively, it was a gigantic place, and yet there was no money. They were dirt poor, and you had all these 7 pieces of property to take care of, 6 buildings and a parking lot. So it became a, it was just, as I say, psychologically very tough. So when I was finishing there, and they asked me, well, what would you like to do? I said, well, I'd love to continue in Spanish ministry, but I'd like to go someplace where there are no buildings. So, just so happened that from the time I had been in New Hampshire, I had gotten, even though I was vocation director and not assigned to a parish, I had gotten involved in the Spanish ministry in town, which was very small, and that's what they had. There was no building. They had Mass every Sunday at the cathedral, the chapel at the cathedral. They had a little office in a convent that was just a place to, have a telephone, and it sounded perfect to me. That there was no buildings to worry about. You didn't have to worry about money, paying the bills and all of that. So I volunteered for that, and my provincial, we went up and visited, and he liked the idea. But what happened is, from the time I signed on the dotted line, they had changed bishops. So we met with the new bishop, and we went to see him, and the new bishop was a wonderful man. He said, what this Spanish community needs is a parish. They've been like wandering for 25 years, and they don't have a home. They have no parish. They have Mass at the chapel and the cathedral. There's never a place to gather, So what they need is a parish. So we would like you to take over this parish in the heart of the city that's the oldest parish in town. It's like St. John's here in Middletown. It was the first church, and it was for the Irish, but there were very few people left, and there were no kids, or a handful. Confirmation class was like 10 people. So, and the bishop's idea was to make that the home of the Hispanic apostolate as of a certain date when I was going there. So it was like, I said, okay, I didn't want buildings, but here we go again. So that's what happened, and by the stroke of a pen, he made 100 families became parishioners of that parish on October 1st of 1990. And
no kidding.
We had now the challenge of bringing into what was basically a dying parish of very good, faithful people, but there were not that many left. And they got in one day, and they had no kids. And in one day, they ended up with this 100 Hispanic families where there was kids galore. and all of the life and the vibrancy that Hispanic people bring to a parish, not unlike St. Francis here in Middletown.
Really?
And the challenge becomes then to bring these two communities, which are culturally very different, together. And so that began for me probably the real interesting part of my life, where I went to work with the Hispanic, which I thought was no buildings, but the next thing you know, we have a big community in an old 150-year-old church, and again, no money, and make it work. And we started to do that. But funny thing is, these were the early 90s. So next thing we know, we have Vietnamese people coming to church at our parish, because we were right in the heart of the city. And that was where the housing, when they moved refugees in, they lived in the oldest apartments in town.
Yeah.
We have Vietnamese coming to church, and the diocese decided, well, we need to reach out to the Vietnamese. So they sent a Vietnamese priest used to come up every Saturday night and have mass for the Vietnamese community, and that began to grow, by leaps and bounds, where they had, in the end, about 100 people at mass on Saturday night. There were, like 50 families
Really?
50 Catholic families. So that was within like 2 years of having gone there to work with the Spanish. Then came, and this was the time of these, refugees. It's not unlike today, except in those days we were taking them.
Right.
Then you had the war in Bosnia-Herzegovina, and so we had Bosnian refugees coming in. And so next thing you know, we have a not as big as the Vietnamese, but a whole group, identifiable group of Bosnian people who were coming to church. Now, what made it a little easier is that most of them spoke some English, because they had come from refugee camps in Germany, and because of that, they had learned English in Germany. And they were also people who had industrial trades. They were machinists, they were carpenters, they were mechanics. It wasn't like the Vietnamese were rice farmers, and finding a job here when that's what your trade is. So the Bosnian folks came in, and it was a wonderful addition. But now we have English, Spanish, Vietnamese, and Bosnian.
Why not?
And then to add to that, in the late 90s, people came to come from Africa. And so first from Sudan, because that was like today, Sudan was in terrible shape, South Sudan in particular. And so the Sudanese began to come. And again, although they had various native tribal languages that they might be their first language, Arabic was the common language for them, but many of them spoke English too.
Oh.
And so now we've got the Sudanese contingent coming in to our church. So what we used to call the English Mass was now made up of people of Irish and Franco-American descent, along with the Bosnians and the Africans. So this, in the end, created at the same time a great challenge, but a wonderful model of what the church is supposed to be. And so I ended up being there I went in 1990. I had a 2-year hiatus because I had to go back to New York for an administrative position for 2 years. I returned, and I was there till 2006. So I've altogether 14 years in that parish. And so
really?
When we had something like Easter, for example, the Easter Vigil, so everybody was together. And so, how we do a lot of readings at Easter Vigil, and we would do many more than we do here now, but you had a reading in Vietnamese, and the choir sang a thing, and a reading in Arabic, and the choir sang, and a reading in Spanish, and the choir sang. So, we joke here at St. Pius, it's 2.5 hours for the Easter Vigil.
Right.
It's only in English. But there, it was 4 hours.
Yeah. Oh, I've been to masses like that.
To go through
Killing masses.
individual,
Yeah.
but it was a wonderful model of church. And I left there 10 years ago, 11. But I have to say that that spirit really continues. It's a wonderful gift to everyone, all of us, to be able to share the faith with people of different cultures. So that became, and I mentioned it before that earlier that it's in Brooklyn. The challenge was sort of, to me, was sort of psychological because of the extreme poverty and the really extreme violence that existed there at the time, on pressure on the people, on the families, and whereas in New Hampshire it was more or less physical. It was just a lot of work because you're trying to give your attention. I was by myself. You're trying to give your attention to this community, and they have certain needs. Some of them are cultural, sometimes crises, and then that one has certain needs, and it only was like every now and then everyone needed you at the same time. So it became, that was to me the challenge there. But it was a wonderful time for me in terms of, as I said in the beginning, when I look back, I said I never thought I'd work with Spanish speaking, and then certainly not Bosnians or Vietnamese or African. Yeah. And in our parish there, after the Sudanese came, they started bringing people from other African nations, not Sudanese. So they were from Africa, but they were from Western Africa. So
that's different too.
Different world where basically, the people's background, for many of them, was French. They had been French colonies, and I love this one example of a family who came from Congo, and they were both professors at Southern New Hampshire University. One was a professor of macroeconomics and the other microeconomics, and they had a child. They had a boy. They met in Russia. So from the Congo, they were sent to school in Russia to learn economics, and they met over there. They married. They had their child. So their first language was their native language from the Republic of the Congo. Their second language was French. Their third language was Russian. Their child's language was Russian. And they came to the United States to learn English.
Man. That's amazing.
So, and
that is amazing.
There's one other story from that time which was really very touching to me, which was a family from I'm trying to remember, also Congo, he was a doctor, and he had maybe 4 children, and at that time there was a lot of persecution of Catholics. You couldn't overtly practice your Catholic faith, so there was no such thing. He couldn't baptize his children. So whatever praying they did secretly, but there was no. You were in danger. Your life was in danger if you did that. So he sent his 2 girls to Uganda with relatives or something, but out of the country. And he himself got out of the country, came here to the States. And when they got to the United States, he was a doctor, he was an MD, but he didn't have a license to practice. So he got a job as a school janitor. And while working as a school janitor, he was also, in the mornings, he was going around drawing blood. You know how they'll go to institutions, and then anyone who needs blood work, they do it on the spot. So he was doing that because he had the experience, and you needed a simpler license. And at nighttime, he was going to get certification to get his doctor's license back to be able to practice. The university, again, Southern New Hampshire, got involved, and they managed to get his two daughters. Oh, in the meantime, he had twins here in the U.S. They had twin children. We baptized them. But Southern New Hampshire University managed to get his two daughters, who were at that point about 18 years old, into our country. We got all the permits, and they did all this stuff. They got him in, and so they went through the RCIA, and I can't tell you the joy in that man's face when his two 18-year-old daughters were finally baptized, here in this country.
Oh, beautiful.
So
beautiful.
There are stories again abounding like that, and it was such a.
But that's something when you see that and you experience it, and of course you're right there on the altar, which is to me heaven. It's very, very, very touching. To me, it's very, very endearing. And it's a mystery. It's such a beautiful mystery. To be embraced. I wish that everybody was baptized. It's wonderful.
If you remember from the from the play, I don't know what day you went to see it, but
no, it was yesterday.
Yeah, the play this weekend. The song we were talking tonight at supper, the friars, about the play and reliving moments of the play and what stands out. And today, the song that's been in my head all day today, you can't get it out of your head, was, "What do you want to be a priest for?"
Yeah.
And to me, these are the reasons why you say, well, in the beginning, I wanted to be a priest because I knew priests in my parish. I got to know some in high school. I didn't want to be a teacher, but I somehow wanted to do what they do, even though I honestly didn't know what it was. I mean, we only know the obvious things. We know they say Mass, and they, do funerals, and they do weddings, but you kind of learn as you go. But when I look back now on these 39 years, and that song keeps ringing in my head today, what do you want to be a priest for? But there's so many moments, like some of the ones that I've mentioned. There are many, many more, moments over the years of, of being a priest, and the joy that it brings in places like I mentioned, but also here at St. Pius. What I love here, I tell this to every new parishioner who doesn't really know anything about St. Pius, who might move.
Right.
Yeah, I say to them, we're 60 years old this year, and 60 years ago, Middletown had certainly St. John's Parish from the very beginning, founded for the Irish and anyone else who was Catholic who was around. And then, probably 50 years later, it was the only place in town. And 50 years later, with the establishment of St. Francis on the south end of town for Irish, but also not just by that point. You had other immigrants coming in. You had German, you had some Polish, and then the Italian immigration into so now you've got St. John's, St. Francis, St. Sebastian, and of course St. Mary Czestochowa for the Polish. And those parishes, and in those days, you went to your ethnic parish. You went to the Polish church. You went to the Italian church. It's the way that people managed to maintain their faith and their culture and so on.
Right.
Well, after World War II, Bishop Flanagan foresaw that things were changing. When soldiers came home from World War II, they came back with the GI Bill, which was for education but also for housing. You could get a mortgage, a GI mortgage, to build a house. And so they had started on this end of Middletown, which was the country, to build houses. And Bishop foresaw that he was going to need another parish, that St. John's would never be able to maintain all of this. So they decided they wanted to establish another parish. And so it just so happened that the Capuchins were interested in working in a parish in Connecticut. So by the grace of God, somehow the two of them came together, and they had this vision and created St. Pius, which was carved completely out of St. John's Parish.
No kidding, yeah.
1957. It wasn't that it took a little bit from everybody else. Everything was part of St. John's Parish, and I'm sure that was probably a painful moment for some people in those days. But there was nothing here. And
right.
So, but you saw the wisdom of how. I always tell folks that one of the things about St. Pius is just by the providence of God is that it wasn't the Irish parish, and it wasn't the Italian parish, and it wasn't the Polish parish. It was just a parish. And so
exactly.
The people who moved into this area and joined were mostly younger families, because these were people building houses in order to take jobs that were becoming available at Pratt & Whitney and all kinds of places in the area. And they were people from with all kinds of ethnic backgrounds. They were Polish, they were Italian, they were Irish, they were German. We had people from all over, and it's always sustained that image. And it also the whole idea of being a very family-oriented parish.
Oh yeah.
It wasn't.
Well, you guys, the Capuchins do it that way too, because following St. Francis, which is basically earthly bound, I feel, and very simple. You guys live that life, and you share your personal experiences like you're doing tonight, and that I find embracing, very embracing. And not all parishes do that. The priests don't do that. So it is special. St. Pius is special. It's a very special church to me. And living in Portland, we're not going to give it up.
Right. They came here to again, the Capuchins came because, the bishop wanted the priest to run a parish, and the Capuchins were looking for a training center for young brothers. So when the diocese purchased the property of St. Pius, the 20 acres, they purchased it, and then the Capuchins bought back part of those 20 acres, 12 of the 20 acres, in order to establish the friary, what we call the friary, and as a training ground for the young brothers. So that it was something that they learned how to take care of the outdoors. They were trained as cooks. They were trained as tailors. They were trained as sandal makers, because in those days we used to make our own sandals. And as the door porter, we call it, the person who takes care of the receptionist. And also, mechanical things, electricity and, fixing, and because those were needed in all of our other friaries, and so people had to get the training somewhere. And so for us at here, this was the perfect spot. And so now we're blessed because it's such a beautiful area, and we're blessed that someone had the foresight to do all of that and still provide a parish in this side of Middletown for people. So.
Right, and I noticed that even at the CCD Center, having done a little bit of work in there years ago, up in the ceilings, all the wiring up there. So there was a lot of machinery that was in that unit. Now, of course, it's a school,
right.
But back then it looked like that was heavily mechanical.
Well, it was built by the Capuchins as a printing operation. So in those days they had they used to print pamphlets, and they had been doing it down in Manhattan and New York City, but they were constrained by space. They just had no room. And so here we suddenly had a lot of space, and they built that building, and it became a printing ministry. As a matter of fact, Father Don Bosco, who's with us here now, retired. Yeah. He was one of the ones who moved the whole printing operation up here in
I didn't know that.
In 1960. and worked in it. So his first kind of time at St. Pius, go back to the early 60s, he was not really on the parish staff. He was part of the printing operation. He was, a writer, and that's what he did. And it's only later, as that kind of ministry kind of dwindled, after Vatican II, that the parish purchased the building from the Capuchins and then converted it into a school, as you say, the school for religious education and faith formation. And so it had to be converted into the rooms that are there now. So we're very fortunate to have that space there.
Yes. Now, let's see, how are we doing on time here, Bob? We got about another 5 minutes. Just out of curiosity, when you had mentioned you were alone up in New Hampshire, is there a reason why you didn't have enough priests to go up with you, an assistant, or anybody else?
Well, I didn't live alone, but in terms of the ministry in the parish, I was the only priest at the time.
Hey, what's that noise?
I don't know. It's not me.
Bob?
No, I don't hear anything.
No, we do. You're moving. Yeah, I think you're moving your mic.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
So I would, because before there was just one priest assigned to do that work, but of course it started to grow, tremendously. So I didn't live alone. There were probably 6 friars between 2 communities in the city. It's just that I was the only one assigned at the parish at the time. So when you needed to, like here, you would get help from other people, but they were not assigned to the parish. One friar worked in the youth prison. Another one worked with the deaf and persons with disabilities. Another one was a hospital chaplain. So there were different ministries, but I was the one in the parish.
Wow, that's amazing. So you had a lot of crosses up there, all those different people coming in.
Well, it was
I can't believe you did that.
It was a blessing, I have to say. It really was. And in many ways, we see some of it here at St. Pius. When you look out there on any given Sunday, we have people from the Philippines, we have people from India, we have people from Sri Lanka, directly first-generation folks from those countries.
Right.
But the second generation of families whose families came, and we have Polish people here, but families who came from Italy and Poland and India and Sri Lanka and the Philippines and a number of Latin people from various Latin countries, and I think
2 minutes.
I think it's to me it's a picture of the church around the world. Almost anywhere. I don't think you'd be hard pressed to go somewhere unless you really go out into the country and have anywhere and find Mass with only one kind of people there.
Right. Wow. Very interesting.
I tell people all the time that I was in. I had reason to a couple of times to visit Japan, and I never was at Mass in Japan that wasn't in more than one language. So in Japan, you had Japanese, but it was either Japanese and English or Japanese and some other language. So I think that's a picture of the church in around the world today.
That's beautiful.
Wonderful journey, Father Gallagher. Thank you so much for being with us. And Tony, thank you for arranging it.
Yeah, thank you,
and, Father, could you give us your final blessing?
Okay. May the Lord be with us. May He bless us and keep us. And may God bless us in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Amen.
Amen. Okay, we'll be back again next week, same time, same station, with the messenger And we'll see you then. Thanks, you folks. Bye-bye.
Bye.
God bless.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.